As we saw in our first pivot table video, we can use this tool to calculate, summarize, and analyze data. In this video, we'll look at additional pivot table functionality, such as adding a slicer to carve up or filter the table, and pivot charts. So here we have the pivot table we created in our first video. The pivot table is on sheet 2, and the data that is driving that pivot table is over here on a separate sheet. As you look at that pivot table, you may start to question some of the values that you see here. Well, Excel gives us the ability to drill into the detail, and you can do that by double clicking on a pivot table value cell. When you do that, Excel is going to create a new sheet with a list of all the records that make up that total value. It's called the Show Details command. Let's take a look. So if you're looking at this pivot table, the values again are here on the calculated information on the inside of that pivot table. If you take a look at one of those values and you say, well, how did we get to this number? Or why is this so high? Why is this so low? You can simply double click it. So let's do this, the women's polo in the Northwest. I'm going to go ahead and double click that. And what Excel does is produce a new sheet. See this, sheet 3. And what we're looking at is an extraction of that information, just letting us know how we reached that $728 sort of value there. So you can use this show detail. It's certainly a helpful feature. Again, it will be pulled into a separate sheet. So maybe, so your file and your workbook doesn't get too cluttered. When you're done analyzing it, the suggestion is to go ahead and delete that extraction, that extra detail sheet. And you can do that by right-clicking the tab at the bottom and using the delete option. Okay, so in our first video, we looked at adding fields into the filters quadrant so that we can change what's displayed in the pivot table. If you're looking for a little more flexibility with regards to filtering, you'll want to add slicers. So the way that this works is over on the Analyze tab underneath your pivot table tools up there on the ribbon, we can choose the command to insert slicer. And what we're seeing is a list of fields from the data, not just the fields that are displayed in our pivot table, all of the fields. So that gives you a little more flexibility. So I'm going to take one that we do have, that's region, and I'm going to go ahead and take one that we don't have included in here, which is our sales rep. Again, you can choose as many as necessary and click on OK. And here are the slicers. So I'm just going to move them around. They can be moved, they can be resized, right? And basically what you're using these to do is to click the buttons and they'll filter your pivot table. So if I just want to see Alicia's sales displayed in my pivot table, I just click that button. And now, again, I'm not looking at everything. I'm just looking at Alicia's sales. If you want more than one sales rep to display, not a problem. You can use this option, multi-select, and you can go ahead and select as many as necessary. So here we have Alicia, Mike, and Susan. To clear a filter that you've applied through your slicer, there's a button in the top right. So again, you can just go ahead and select one or more of the options here to change what's displayed in your pivot table. These can also be, I'm just going to clear that. These can also be formatted to match your pivot table. So as you select a slicer on the Slicer Tools Options tab, you have the same sort of gallery that you saw with the pivot table itself. We looked at that in the first video. And you can go ahead and click on whichever it is that you want to apply, whatever style you think looks good or matches your pivot table. So there you go, your slicers. If you don't want a slicer anymore, you just select it and press the delete key on your keyboard and it will disappear. Okay. Here's the other one. Deleting it. And then we're back to just the pivot table itself. Now, in addition to the pivot table itself, which displays the numeric information, you can also add a pivot chart to see it graphically. So in order to accomplish that, just click on any cell inside of your pivot table. On the pivot table tools tabs, just go over to Analyze, and you'll be able to click on Pivot Chart. going to stick with a column chart, which is selected by default. And there's a couple of variants along the top. I'm just going to pick one of the 3D clustered here. Click on OK. Here is a chart that's going to represent that information. Now it's blocking the pivot table, so I'm going to just drag it down underneath. You can also resize it. Just use the circles that you'll see in the corners and on the sides, just like a regular chart. And here once again is the graphical representation of the information that is in that pivot table. It can also be filtered. So if you wanted to focus on a particular category, shirt style, or region, you can go ahead and do that. For example, in the legend, I've got the various regions. I can go ahead and use that drop down to select maybe one or more regions that I want to focus on. And it will filter the pivot table itself up above, as well as the pivot chart. So you can certainly get a chance to see the graphical representation of that same information as well. If you need to remove that pivot chart, just give it a click so it's selected, press the delete key on the keyboard, and it will go away for you. Okay, next we're going to change this pivot table up a little bit. I'm going to turn off category and shirt style, and I'm just going to bring sales rep back down into the rows section. Just want to talk a little bit about sorting and maybe changing the information that displays in here. If you want, you can sort the information in your pivot table. Maybe I'd like to see my salespeople in ascending or descending order based on their total sales. And that is easy to do. Just right click one of the values there inside the pivot table, and you can go ahead and do your sort either in ascending or descending. Give it a click and it sorts the whole pivot table so that you can see them in ranking order. Another thing that you may decide to do is perhaps see, instead of the totals, you can actually change the way the information displays in here. And one way to do that is just using the button, as we did earlier in our first video, and clicking on value field settings. We came in here to go ahead and change the kind of calculation it did, but you can also come in here to change the way the information is displayed. So over on the Show Values As tab, I can use this drop down to say maybe show me a percentage of the column or grand total. Give that a click. And now I can see, for example, how their percentages are going to relate to one another. The same thing can also be accomplished up here on the Analyze tab. You can go into the field settings from the button on that ribbon. And over on Show Values As, one more time, just want to come in here and maybe come down and say, rank these, right? So I can go ahead and rank them based on sales rep. Click on OK. And then I'm able to see the way that they rank, their grand totals, their individual region totals, etc. So that is something you can do to your pivot table as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that back, go back into value field settings, or use the field settings button up there on the ribbon. And on the Show Values As, I'm just going to flip this back to no calculation. And then we'll be back to seeing just the totals. With your pivot table, it's also possible to create a new field, maybe a calculated field that didn't exist in the original data. And that can be done by coming into your pivot table, and on the Analyze tab of your pivot table tools, there's going to be an option here to be able to add fields, items, and sets. And for example, choose the calculated field. You can give your field a name. So let's create a commission calculation. And in the formula, maybe we want to say that the commission is going to be 2%, for example, of their total sales. So I've already got the beginnings of my formula here. I'm just getting rid of that 0. I can take the field I want to manipulate and insert it either by double clicking it or using the Insert Field button there. And I'm just going to multiply that. Remember, the symbol for multiplication is the star. and I'm going to say maybe it's, 2%. So I can go ahead and type in my 2 and percent. Okay. I can go ahead and click on OK. And then what I have is the commission. So 1% of Melanie's commission of 88,000 is 1,761. So for each column that I have there, I'm going to be able to see it, and then there'll be a grand total as well. That is added into the columns quadrant, and it's added into the values quadrant. And you can certainly remove it if you wanted to. Just go ahead and get rid of that. Remove the field. And you are back to where you began. So just keep in mind that if the original information or the information didn't exist in the original list, you can certainly create a calculated field to add to your pivot table. And that's it for our second pivot table session. See you again soon.